Cold winds blew through the night, shaking the shutters of a lonely farmhouse at the edge of town. Inside, a single lamp glowed softly. An elderly widow, with no children and lots of debt, frail and tired from years of being alone, stood at her window, holding a worn shawl, listening to the storm howl outside. It had been 15 years since her husband died, leaving her to take care of a house that was too big, a silence that was too heavy, and a life that seemed to get smaller with each passing season. And yet, on this night, the sound that reached her was not the cry of the wind, but the desperate roar of motorcycle engines fighting against the cold. 20 men, leather jackets soaked, faces frozen, stood shivering at her gate. She hesitated. Who were they? What if danger followed them in? But in the end, kindness won over fear. She opened her door. Even with so little left to give, she could not turn them away. She never knew that by morning, her forgotten farmhouse would stand at the center of a roar unlike anything her quiet town had ever heard. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you are watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The night was bitter, a cold that sank deep into the bones and shook every loose shutter on the farmhouse. Inside, an elderly widow named Martha sat hunched by a small lamp, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The house was silent, too silent. 15 years had passed since her husband Henry died, and the rooms that once rang with laughter had long since fallen quiet. There were no children to come home, no voices to ease the stillness, just her, a pile of unpaid bills on the table, and the frightening fear that the bank might one day take what little she had left. Martha had never imagined her life would shrink to this. A woman alone, drowning in debt, the world forgetting she existed one season at a time, and yet, despite it all, she carried herself with a quiet strength. Her days followed a pattern so steady it was like a ritual. She woke before dawn, boiled water for tea, and sat at her kitchen table, staring at the same view Henry once loved. The fields stretching far beyond the frost-covered glass. She would feed the birds, take care of the few surviving plants in her garden, and then go back indoors, where time moved in slow, heavy steps. Neighbors drove past her property without stopping. They knew who she was, but rarely called. Some said she wanted it that way, a widow holding on to memories rather than people. Others whispered that her sadness made conversation too heavy, too uncomfortable, as though they might catch her loneliness if they stayed too long. And so the visits got fewer, and her name faded from the lips of the community around her. But Martha did not complain. She carried her loneliness as if it were part of her, a companion as familiar as her own reflection. When night fell, she would sit by the fire in Henry's old armchair, her hands holding a worn shawl he once bought her at a county fair, the fabric fraying but still smelling faintly of cedar. She whispered his name sometimes, as if the walls might carry the sound to wherever he had gone. Outside, a storm was gathering. The first flakes of snow drifted lazily, but the air carried the sharp edge of something heavier, something unstoppable. The wind clawed at the shutters, and the chimney groaned as if struggling under the force of nature's breath. It was the kind of storm that made travelers speed up, that made families huddle close indoors, that made the roads dangerous and the night cruel. For Martha, it was another reminder of how weak she was in this big, empty house. The storm outside grew thicker, wrapping the house in a blanket of snow. The shutters banged like distant drums, and Martha pulled her shawl tighter. It was a night like many others, lonely, weary, filled with the echoes of memory, and yet something stirred in the air, something she could not name. The farmhouse stood fragile against the howl of the wind, but what was coming would not be carried by the storm alone. The storm had swallowed the night whole. Snow whipped across the fields like shards of glass, and the lonely farmhouse groaned beneath the weight of the wind. Inside, Martha sat in her chair, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, listening to the storm with the tired patience of a woman who had seen many winters. She thought she knew this sound, the whine of the wind, the crack of a branch, the restless groan of the earth. But then it came. At first she thought it was thunder, a rolling growl beneath the storm. But it did not fade. It grew louder, stronger, as though the ground itself was shaking. She leaned closer to the window, heart beating faster than she liked to admit. Through the blur of snow and darkness, faint pinpricks of light appeared, weaving, bouncing, multiplying, One became 5, 5 became 10, then 20, headlights cutting through the storm like fiery eyes in the night. Engines, the sound pressed against her walls, low and rumbling, shaking the glass in its frame. Martha froze, her breath catching in her chest. Motorcycles here at the farthest edge of town in the middle of a blizzard. It made no sense. Yet there they were, 20 figures, dressed in leather, soaked to the bone, their bikes grouped together like beasts seeking shelter. The air outside seemed to shiver with their arrival. The riders got off their bikes, their boots sinking deep into the snow. They stood in the glow of their headlights, steam rising from engines that fought to stay alive against the cold. Their faces were hidden beneath helmets and scarves, but their bodies told the story, shoulders hunched, arms held against the cold, movements stiff with exhaustion. These were not men out for the joy of the ride. These were travelers stranded, caught in a storm that threatened to destroy them. Martha's breath fogged the glass as she peeked through the curtain. She felt her chest tighten, fear twisted in her stomach. She was alone, fragile, with nothing but a lock and a door between her and 20 strangers. Her mind raced with possibilities. Who were they? Where had they come from? Why her gate, her house, her quiet little world? The knock came, slow, heavy, a fist against wood, muffled by the storm but unmistakable. Once, twice, 3 times. Martha did not move. The second knock followed, louder, demanding, carrying a weight that made her flinch. She held her shawl tighter, her fingers shaking against the fabric. Her eyes looked over to the old telephone on the wall. Should she call the sheriff? Would anyone come through the storm in time? Or would she be left to face whatever stood at her door alone? The knock came again. This time a voice followed. Deep, rough, yet strangely steady. Ma'am, please, we're freezing out here. She hesitated, torn between instinct and compassion. Every warning she had ever learned screamed at her to stay behind the lock, to let the storm take them, to protect herself from what might come if she opened that door. And yet another sound rose inside her, not from the storm, not from the men outside, from memory. Henry's voice, clear, as if he were standing beside her once more. Always help the traveler, Martha, he had told her long ago. Even if he looks like an enemy, the road changes a man. Sometimes all he needs is a place to rest. She swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against her fear. Slowly she rose from her chair. Her knees ached as she crossed the wooden floor, each step echoing too loudly into silence. At the door, she paused, her hand hovering over the latch. The storm waited outside, carrying with it the rumble of idling engines and the murmur of 20 men waiting. She could feel the cold seeping in through the cracks, biting at her skin as if reminding her of what they must be suffering. Desperation clung to the air. Still, doubt lingered. What if danger walked in with them? What if opening this door meant she would never see another sunrise? Her fingers touched the latch. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She saw Henry's smile, felt the strength of his hand in hers, heard once more his quiet faith in people, even strangers. The memory steadied her, shaking. With a breath as fragile as it was brave, Martha turned the latch and pulled open the door. Snow and wind rushed inside, swirling around her shawl. Beyond the doorway stood a figure, tall, broad, his leather jacket soaked, his beard frozen with pieces of ice. He removed his helmet, showing tired eyes that, despite their roughness, carried something human. He bowed his head slightly, almost respectfully, and spoke again. "Please, ma'am, we don't mean trouble, just warmth." Martha's hand stayed on the latch even after it was shut. She could hear the storm beating against the windows, desperate to get inside again. But the storm was no longer her biggest worry. It was these men taking off their soaked jackets, unbuckling gloves stiff with frost, shaking off the night's cruelty in her living room. Leather hung heavy on the backs of her chairs. Boots stomped near the fire, sending water droplets hissing against the crackling wood. The old farmhouse groaned beneath the weight of so many bodies. Men too large for its small rooms, their presence filling the silence that had been her companion for so long. Martha's breath caught as she looked at them. Their tattoos, their scars, the hardness carved into their features. It all spoke of lives lived at the edge of society, far from the gentle rhythms of farmhouses and kitchens. And yet beneath that armor of leather and steel, she saw the weariness. The shivering hands, the raw red skin damaged by the storm. They were dangerous perhaps, but they were also human, Still, tension hung in the air like smoke. Two of the men whispered to each other, their voices low, eyes looking toward the door, as if unsure whether to trust the shelter they had found. One sat with his arms folded tight, staring at the fire as though challenging it to warm him. Yet another crouched by the fireplace, hands stretched toward the flames, tears forming in his eyes as the heat returned to his skin. Thankfulness and doubt shared the same space, pulling the air tight like a wire about to snap. Martha steadied herself with a breath. She did the only thing she knew, what her hands had always done in times of fear. She went to the kitchen. The sound of her small footsteps echoed against the heavy boots behind her. She pulled a pot from the cupboard, filled it with water from the pump, and set it on the stove. Her hands shook, but they did not stop. Bread. She had baked 2 loaves the morning before, a habit that stayed long after she stopped expecting visitors. She sliced them with slow care, her knife moving through the crust. Butter, kept cool by the winter air, softened in the heat of her hands. She laid out what she had, plain and simple, and the smell of it drifted into the room like a memory of gentler times. One by one, the men looked toward the kitchen. They shifted in their seats, their hardened expressions softening just slightly as the smell reached them. Hunger beat doubt. Martha poured steaming soup into old bowls, the broth thin but hot, and carried them into the room. The men took them with hands that shook, not from anger, but from cold and need. A whispered, "God bless you," rose from one corner. A quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," from another. Thankfulness, awkward and held back, but real. Yet still, a few stayed silent, their eyes watchful, their posture stiff. They accepted her kindness as if it were a trade rather than a gift, as if trust could not be bought with bread and soup alone. Martha noticed, but she did not judge. She had learned long ago that appearances rarely told the whole story. Her thoughts drifted backward beyond the storm, beyond the strangers to another time. Henry, she saw him in uniform, standing tall in photographs now yellowed with age. Her husband had been a soldier before he was her partner. He had known war, hardship, the edge of survival. He had told her once, his eyes distant, that the fiercest faces often hid the kindest souls, that a man who looked like an enemy might one day save your life. It was that memory that steadied her hands now. As she moved from man to man, offering what little she had, she remembered Henry's quiet lessons. Do not let fear blind you. Do not mistake roughness for cruelty. Do not forget that every stranger carries a story you do not know. The farmhouse, once empty with silence, now hummed with life, uneasy, fragile, but alive. The storm outside roared, but within these walls, another storm grew. One of doubt balanced against thankfulness, fear softened by mercy. The night stretched on, the storm outside clawing at the walls as if determined to remind everyone in that house that winter was merciless. Inside, the fire cracked and hissed, spitting sparks against the stone fireplace, its glow painting faces that were equal parts tired and careful. The room was crowded now, with leather jackets draped over chairs, boots lined in a row that muddied her wooden floor, and the heavy silence of men who had learned not to trust the kindness of strangers. But slowly, almost unwillingly, that silence began to break. One of the younger bikers, his face drawn and pale, let slip the story of their night. Their group had been strong when they started, a wall of engines tearing across the highway, but the storm had scattered them. Some had turned back. Others were swallowed by the cold in the distance. These 20 had pushed forward until the road itself seemed to disappear beneath the snow, and desperation drove them to the faint light glowing in Martha's window. Martha listened carefully, her hands held tightly in her lap. She saw beyond the show of the leather and chains. She saw men whose shoulders carried burdens heavier than the storm. One shifted in his chair, and she caught the glimpse of bruises that crawled up his arm, fading purple against pale skin. Another winced as he bent forward, exhaustion painted in the lines under his eyes. These were not men untouched by struggle. They were shaped by it. For a moment, her mind drifted backward, back to the years when her husband wore his army uniform. Shoulders squared, eyes shadowed by things he never fully shared. He used to tell her that life on the road or in the field stripped men down, that it was in hardship you saw their truth, not in how they looked, but in how they carried the weight laid upon them. Martha remembered those words now, seeing past the rough outsides before her. Across the room, the leader sat apart, his back straight, his presence commanding without a word. His eyes were sharp, watchful, taking in every movement, every flicker of expression. Martha found herself meeting his eyes more than once, and though his face gave little away, there was something there, something that softened ever so slightly when she offered another slice of bread, or when her shaking hand set down a fresh cup of steaming broth before one of his men. Later, when the fire had burned lower and the shadows grew longer, Martha found herself in the kitchen, refilling a pot with water. The leader had followed, his heavy boots landing softly on the old wooden planks. He said little, but when he did, his voice was lower than she expected, edged not with threat, but with the calm of a man used to command. He thanked her, not in big words, but in the brief honesty of someone who did not offer thanks lightly. For the first time since opening her door, Martha felt the faint trace of respect pass between them. Yet not all eyes in that house were softened. At the edges of the firelight, whispers coiled between some of the men. Their voices hushed but not lost completely, filled with doubt, questions rose. Who was this woman to open her home to them so freely? What did she want in return? Could kindness be trusted in a world where betrayal was common? The storm raged louder outside, but it was the storm inside, the thin crack of doubt among the bikers that seemed to chill Martha most. She stood at the edge of her own kitchen, feeling their eyes on her back, and for a quick moment, she wondered if she had welcomed safety into her home, or something far more dangerous. The fire had settled into a steady glow, the kind of fire that did not shout or blaze, but breathed slow and steady like the heartbeat of the room. Its light reached into the corners, softening the shadows that had once hung so heavily over Martha's parlor. Smoke curled lazily up the chimney, carrying with it the smell of burned oak and damp wool drying by the hearth. The air was thick with warmth now, but it was not only the fire that pushed back the cold. It was something else, something unseen that had begun to stir between the strangers gathered there. Martha sat nearest the hearth, as if anchoring herself to the light. Her hands, worn and fragile, lay folded tightly in her lap. She could hear everything, the shuffle of boots as men shifted in their chairs, the low rumble of voices trading half-whispered words, the creak of the wooden beams that had held her house together longer than she had been alone. Each sound carried weight, but none pressed on her chest as much as the silence she had carried for years. And then, without quite meaning to, she broke it. Her voice slipped into the room like a thread of smoke, and when she admitted that she sometimes talked aloud to the walls just to hear a voice other than her own, her voice faltered. But she did not stop. The room shifted with her honesty. Men who had entered her home with hard jaws and guarded eyes now sat frozen, listening. One rested his elbows on his knees, staring into the fire as if its flames replayed his own memories. Another leaned back, arms crossed tight against his chest, though his face showed the struggle of a man trying not to let emotion rise too freely. A younger one, whose tattoos climbed his neck like ivy, rubbed at his eyes roughly, pretending it was the smoke that stung. The leader stayed still, but his gaze was fixed on Martha. Hours earlier, those eyes had been sharp and judging, ready to measure threat in every shadow. But now they softened, not with pity, but with understanding. He too seemed to know what it was to lose, what it was to carry silence that shouted louder than any noise. Then came the voices of the men, not loud, not boastful, but low and raw. Each word pulled up like a stone from deep water. One spoke of a brother he'd lost overseas, his voice cracking as he described the empty chair at his mother's table. Another admitted he had never stopped hearing the echo of gunfire even in sleep. A third told of nights on the road, when the silence grew so heavy it felt like a coffin pressing down on his chest, leaving him gasping for air. Not all of their scars had been earned in uniform, but all were real. They spoke of broken families, of friends buried too young, of brothers who had turned to the road not for rebellion but for safety. Beneath the tattoos and the leather, beneath the roar of their engines and the armor of reputation, they were men marked by the same grief that had carved itself into Martha's life. Veterans of war, survivors of loss, souls stitched together by pain and loyalty in equal measure. The fire became their witness. Its warmth loosened truths that the world outside would never hear from them. In that parlor, Words that had been buried under years of toughness and silence finally surfaced, fragile, yet undeniable. Martha listened, and with each story, something inside her shifted. The loneliness that had pressed on her for 15 long years did not vanish, but it began to ease. It was as though each man around that fire had reached out and taken a small piece of it from her shoulders, carrying it with their own burdens. For the first time in over 10 years, Martha felt she was not alone. The walls of her house, once suffocating in their emptiness, now seemed to hold something new. Voices, stories, and a strange but undeniable sense of belonging, fragile but real, had returned. She lifted her eyes to the shelf where her husband's photograph stood in its wooden frame. The firelight caught the glass, making his face seem alive in its flicker. For years, that picture had been a wound, a reminder of everything she had lost. But tonight it felt different. Tonight she did not feel the sting of absence. She felt presence as though he were there in the room, nodding with quiet approval at the company she had chosen to keep. The fire crackled louder, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade beneath the weight of what was unfolding within. Every hour seemed to fold into the next, until night itself felt endless. The farmhouse was no longer a place of temporary shelter. It had become a sealed room, a container carrying its unwilling passengers through the storm. Each person inside left to face whatever truths the dark might stir awake. Martha sat by the hearth, her husband's photograph, catching the flicker of the flames. She had placed it there earlier, almost without thought, but now it seemed to watch over the gathering, the face of a man long gone, bearing silent witness. Her gaze stayed on him, her lips parting in a breath that shook between prayer and memory. Around her, the bikers had grown quieter after their earlier confessions. The storm and the fire doing most of the talking. Boots tapped idly. A leather jacket creaked as one man shifted, and the old clock on the shelf marked time with stubborn ticks. Then, slicing through that fragile peace, came a cough. It was not a simple clearing of the throat. It was sharp, ragged, torn from deep in the chest. The sound made heads snap toward it. A second cough followed, harsher still, and a young man slumped forward, his shoulders hunched as though the air itself betrayed him. His breath came fast, uneven, whistling like wind through broken reeds. He tried to wave the concern away, saying between gasps that he was fine, but his body failed him, and he nearly slid from his chair. Panic rushed the room like a sudden flame. Boots scraped against the wooden floor. Chairs groaned. Voices tumbled over one another. Sharp orders, frightened questions. The smell of leather, sweat, and smoke mixed in the sudden chaos. But in the center of it, Martha was already moving. Her small frame, stooped, wrapped in a shawl that had seen better years, rose with surprising speed. She called for space, her voice carrying not the shake of age, but the firmness of command. The men, rough and broad-shouldered, fell back without protest, surprised into silence by the authority in her tone. She knelt beside the young man. Her hands, lined with veins and years, no longer shook. They remembered these were hands that had wrapped wounds, cooled fevers, and steadied men broken by battles they did not speak of. These were the hands of a woman who had lived through sickness, through war, through loss, and had kept others alive in the midst of it. Her fingers pressed lightly against his wrist, counting the hurried beats. She studied the rise and fall of his chest, laid her palm against his forehead, and felt the heat there. With movements practiced long ago, she reached for a bowl, poured water with steady control, and tore a strip from an old sheet she had kept folded in a trunk. She pressed the cool cloth to his burning skin. The room held its breath. "Blankets," she said, not as a request but a command. One man fetched them instantly. "More space," she added, and the circle widened. "Quiet." Her eyes looked toward the louder ones, and even the most restless fell into silence. From the corner, one biker muttered, his disbelief edged with wonder. "She knows what she's doing." Another whispered back, almost reverent, like she's done this before. The leader said nothing, but his dark gaze followed her every move, and for the first time that night, his expression softened, just slightly, almost invisibly. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. The storm outside clawed at the walls, but inside, the farmhouse was locked in its own battle. Breath against breath, life against silence. The young man's coughing eased bit by bit, though his body shook with exhaustion. Martha propped him with pillows, spooned water against his lips, and laid her hand gently against his cheek. The gesture was not cold. It was tender, almost motherly. And in that moment, every man in the room saw her differently. They had come in from the cold to find soup and fire, thinking themselves the strong ones, the survivors, the brotherhood that bent the world to their will. Yet here before their eyes was a widow whose strength was greater than them all, not in muscle or might, but in knowledge, in steadiness, in love, unafraid of hardship. She had turned chaos into calm, fear into order, simply by being what she was, unbroken. The respect in the room was unspoken but undeniable. Shoulders that had been tense with doubt now slumped with relief. Jaws once clenched in distrust loosened, and for the first time that night a faint smile touched the leader's face. It was small, quick, but it carried weight. His men saw it, and that alone shifted the air more than any words could.
Still, beneath the warmth of this fragile peace, questions stayed.
These men, scarred, hardened, bound to one another, were not simply drifters of the open road. There was history in their silence, pain in the way their eyes looked, but did not speak. Martha could feel it as she had once felt the unsaid truths in her husband's silence after long nights at war. There were stories buried under the leather and steel, stories the fire had not yet brought out. The storm raged louder outside, rattling the shutters as if demanding to be let in. But within those four walls, something had shifted. They were no longer strangers caught in a storm. To her, the act of feeding was sacred. Behind her, the bikers stirred. Boots thudded on the floor, voices murmured low, chairs scraped softly as men woke from uneasy rest. But gone was the sharp tension of strangers. Their movements now carried a heaviness, almost a humbleness. These were not marauders preparing to ride. They were guests, and they seemed to know it. When Martha called them to the table, they did not rush forward as hungry men might. Instead, they rose slowly, falling into a kind of line. 20 men in weathered leather moving with quiet order. One by one they came to her, not as if they were entitled to the meal, but as if they understood it was a gift. "Thank you," whispered one, his voice. Another bowed his head slightly, almost in worship. "Ma'am," he said with a softness that did not match the tattoos that crawled up his neck. Each offered words, few but honest. And each time Martha only nodded, as if the thanks belonged not to her but to something greater. She placed food before them, steadying her hands against the shake of age, and in return she received not doubt or threat, but respect. For a moment she allowed herself to believe it was finished, that the night of strange company had ended with nothing more than this, a shared fire, a meal, and a fragile peace. Soon they would ride off, leaving her alone again with her husband's photograph and her silence. The thought brought her a bittersweet relief. She did not fear their leaving, yet unexpectedly she did not welcome it as much as she once might have. The men ate quietly. Their eyes no longer looked around suspiciously. Their shoulders, once squared for battle, now carried something gentler. Thankfulness, perhaps, or the calm that comes after a storm has tested and spared you. And Martha, watching them, thought of her husband's words always help the traveler even if he looks like an enemy. She realized she had lived that belief, and it had not failed her. But just as her heart began to settle into the comfort of closure, she felt something stir. Not outside, not yet. It was within the men themselves, a tension she could not name. Their glances were fewer, but when they came, they stayed at the window as though listening for something beyond the farmhouse walls. Their silence was not the silence of satisfaction, but of waiting. Martha noticed it, though she told herself it was only her imagination. She set another plate down, wiped her hands on her apron, and tried to dismiss the unease. After all, the storm was gone. The sun was rising. Surely the worst had passed. And yet beneath the stillness of snow and the crackle of the fire, there was something else, something she could not yet hear, but which the men in their way seemed to sense. It was as though the night had not ended, only paused, holding its breath for what was still to come. The morning air was brittle and sharp, each breath puffing white against the blue of the clearing sky. Snow glittered across the fields like broken glass, untouched and still. Inside the farmhouse, Martha cleared the table slowly, stacking plates, wiping crumbs with the corner of her apron. She could almost believe it had been a dream. 20 bikers gathered around her fire, 20 hardened men thanking her for bread and broth. But then it came. At first it was only a vibration underfoot, so faint she thought at the quiver of her old bones. The dishes rattled on the counter. The kerosene lamp swayed. Her brow creased, and then from beyond the hills the sound rose low, steady, unstoppable. It was not the wind. It was not the storm. It was a thunder deeper than nature itself. Engines, hundreds of them. Martha froze. Her hand pressed to the window frame. The sound grew, multiplied, until it seemed the earth itself was alive and charging toward her. The bikers inside stiffened, their heads snapping toward the sound. For a moment, no one moved. The floorboards shook. The glasses on her shelf rang against one another like nervous bells. And then, coming over the hill beyond the field, they appeared. A river of chrome and steel, sunlight catching the polished tanks, handlebars flashing like blades. 200 engines roaring together, descending upon the narrow road that led straight to her home. Martha's breath caught in her chest. The sight was almost unreal. An army on wheels, leather-clad figures leaning into the wind, the thunder of their arrival rolling across the valley. It was power raw and absolute, a storm made of men and machines. Her knees weakened. For a heartbeat, she thought this was the end, that kindness had betrayed her, that mercy had invited doom upon her doorstep. She stepped back from the window, one shaking hand rising to her lips. 1,000 Hell's Angels, they were not passing through. They were coming here. The ground quaked as the lead bike swung into her drive. Snow sprayed up beneath their tires. Mud churned beneath the weight of their machines. They did not stop at the edge of her property. They poured in, circling the farmhouse, engines snarling, chrome flashing in the pale light. The sound rattled her chest, pressed against her skull, threatened to swallow her whole. Her quiet street, once forgotten, now roared like an arena. Curtains twitched in neighboring houses. Faces appeared briefly in windows, wide-eyed and pale. Children were pulled back from sight. Doors slammed shut. Locks turned. The neighborhood held its breath, gripped by the kind of fear that spreads faster than fire. Martha stood frozen, framed in the doorway of her home, a lone figure against an army. The men who had shared her fire the night before rose as one. They did not rush, did not panic. They stood, heavy boots echoing against her wooden floors, and walked steadily into the morning light. Their jackets caught the sun, patches glinting, colors bold against the snow. Martha held the door frame as they stepped outside, 20 against 200. She feared for them, feared for herself, feared for the fragile bond that had bloomed in her house. The circle of engines tightened around the farmhouse, a wall of steel and leather. The roar was deafening, shaking the windows, drowning out thought. And then, in the midst of that chaos, the 20 men formed a line before her porch. They stood tall, shoulders squared, faces solemn, not cowering, not retreating, standing. Their presence was defiance and loyalty, and something Martha could not yet name. From her doorway she watched, heart pounding, the world shaking with noise. And though she could not yet understand what it meant, one thing was certain. Dawn had not brought an ending. It had brought the beginning of something far greater. Martha held the doorframe, her fingers white against the wood, her chest tight with dread. The vibrations ran through her bones, and for a quick, sharp moment, she wonders if she has made a terrible mistake the night before, inviting 20 leather-clad strangers into her home without hesitation. Her kindness, once so certain, now feels like a doorway to danger. Her neighbors gather in shadows, too fearful to step fully outside. To them, the sight is apocalyptic. An army of black leather and chrome, pouring down the narrow road like a tidal wave of steel. Children are snatched back from windows. Doors slam and lock in frantic rhythm, and whispers cut through the silence of homes, all carrying the same sharp warning. The widow has brought trouble to our town. And yet, amidst this chaos, the 20 men Martha had fed only hours earlier step forward from her porch. Their boots strike the earth not in arrogance, but in quiet defiance. They stand shoulder to shoulder, back straight, as though bearing the weight of 1,000 watchful eyes. They do not cower. They do not explain. They simply wait as if prepared to face judgment. Then it happens. At the very front of that huge wave of engines, one man lifts his hand. It is such a small gesture, almost invisible against the forest of handlebars and steel. But in an instant, the 1,000 engines obey. The thunder dies, cut short in perfect unison, leaving behind a silence so absolute it feels unnatural. Birds dare not sing. Even the wind seems to pause as though caught between fear and worship. Martha feels her breath catch in her throat. Her heart racing moments ago now pounds with a heavier rhythm. She stares at the man who commands such power with a single motion. His shoulders are broad, his presence undeniable. But it is his eyes that hold her still, steady, unwavering, carrying not threat, but something she cannot yet name. Almost gentle. When he speaks, he doesn't need to shout. His voice, deep and deliberate, rolls across the crowd. Her knees weaken. The fear that moments ago gripped her chest dissolves, replaced by something so unfamiliar she hardly knows what to call it. All humbleness, a recognition that the moment before her is larger than any she has ever lived. All along she had believed she was feeding wanderers in the cold, showing mercy to men long abandoned by the world. But here, surrounded by their silence, by their respect, by the truth hidden in the leader's words, Martha understands how wrong she was. She was never feeding strangers. She had been feeding family, though she had never known it. The moment stretches and holds like time itself has chosen not to move. Neighbors who once whispered behind their curtains now stand frozen, their fear replaced by disbelief. The street, once shaking under the roar of 1,000 engines, now shakes with something else entirely. The weight of truth, the burden of revelation. And for Martha, that silence, 1,000 men standing bowed before her, speaks louder than thunder ever could. Silence still held the air, a silence heavy not with fear but with worship. 1,000 men stood motionless, their heads bowed toward the poor widow who had taken them in. Martha's hands shook against the doorframe, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She had thought the night before was a simple act of mercy, the kind any woman of conscience might offer. But the weight of what stood before her told a different story. The leader stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. In his eyes was no threat, no demand, only the weight of thankfulness carried by a brotherhood that had lived too long with hardened hearts. He looked at Martha, frail in her doorway, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and he gave a slow nod, his voice low but carrying like a vow. "Years ago," he said, "when your husband was still alive, a storm drove one of our own to this very door. He was cold, empty, and forgotten. You gave him food, a blanket, a place to breathe. You never asked his name." Martha's brow tightened. She searched the corners of her memory, but the moment slipped through her like smoke. The leader's eyes stayed on her, steady. That man was the one who coughed through the night, the one you cared for again when no one else knew how. Her lips parted, a breath catching in her chest. The memory flared, a shivering figure at her table long ago, the same face pale and burning with fever the night before. She had forgotten him, but he had carried her with him all these years. The leader's voice grew heavier. "Your kindness was never repaid. Last night, you saved him again, and this time his hand rose, and the men stirred. We will not ride away, owing you." The first truck appeared, before she understood what was happening. Its engine rumbled differently from the motorcycles, lower, heavier, and in its bed were stacked bundles wrapped in covers. Behind it came another, then another, until the quiet street filled with vehicles she had not seen arrive. Neighbors strained their necks from windows, unsure if they were witnessing a siege or a miracle. The leader raised his hand again, and men began to move, not recklessly, not like invaders, but with quiet purpose. Some peeled away toward Martha's porch, carrying heavy envelopes that bulged with papers. Others walked toward her sagging barn, their hands brushing along the warped wood as though checking damage only they could see. A few disappeared around the side of her house where the roof had long since lost its shingles. Martha gripped her shawl tighter, her voice catching in her throat. What are you doing?" she asked, barely above a whisper. The leader's gaze softened. "Paying back a debt," he said simply. And with those words, the weight of what unfolded began to settle upon her shoulders. Inside the envelopes were bank slips stamped and signed. "That's cleared. Property taxes erased. Every notice, every reminder that had haunted her kitchen table had been lifted as though by an unseen hand. She opened one envelope, then another, her shaking fingers grazing the words she could hardly believe were real. Paid in full, stamped in bold red across documents she had carried like chains for years. Tears filled her eyes, spilling onto the papers. For so long she had lived one letter away from losing everything. Her land, her home, the last pieces of her husband's life. And now, with a stroke of kindness, the burden was gone. But the angels were not finished. Hammers rang against wood. The creak of ladders broke the morning air. Men swarmed across the roof, peeling away rotted shingles and laying down fresh boards with the precision of craftsmen. Others set to work on the barn, strengthening beams, patching holes where the wind had howled for decades. One man, his arms tattooed with wings, carried buckets of paint and brushes, whistling low as he set them at her doorstep. The sight left neighbors speechless where once they had seen only threat and leather jackets. They now watched an army rebuild, restore, renew. Even the children pressed their faces to frosted glass, eyes wide at the transformation. Martha stood frozen as the scene unfolded. She had opened her door for warmth, offered soup and bread. Now men she had once feared were replacing broken windows, stacking firewood neatly against her wall, filling her pantry with sacks of flour, sugar, and beans. Some had even led a pair of horses from the truck beds, sturdy creatures that stamped their hooves against the frozen earth before being guided into her stable. Everywhere she looked, hands that once gripped handles and chains now wielded tools with quiet worship. They were not just repairing a house. They were giving back a life. Martha's tears blurred her vision, but through them she saw it clearly. The cracked paint of her walls restored to white. The broken fences mended straight, the home that had felt like a tomb slowly becoming a safe place once more. It was more than charity. It was a promise written not in ink but in action. These men had come not to frighten, not to take, but to leave behind something she thought she had lost forever. Safety, dignity, and belonging. When the sun broke fully through the clouds, its light fell not on an old widow's crumbling farmhouse, but on a place reborn, and in the stillness of that morning. Martha felt her husband's presence again, not in sorrow this time, but in pride. For the first time in 15 years, she no longer feared tomorrow. She had been given back more than her home. She had been given back her life. By mid-morning, the work was done. What had once been a weathered, forgotten farmhouse now stood proud against the winter sun, its roof whole, its fences straight, its walls gleaming with fresh paint. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, not as a lonely signal of one woman's survival, but as a banner of life restored. Martha stood on her porch, the shawl slipping from her shoulders as though she no longer needed its protection. She looked across the yard at the men who had made her burden their own. Tools were set down, paintbrushes rinsed, ladders lowered, and then, as if guided by an unspoken command, 1,000 bikers turned toward their machines. Engines rumbled to life not with threat but with worship. The sound rolled across the town like a hymn sung in steel and fire. One by one, the men swung into their saddles, chrome catching the morning light, leather creaking as they settled. It was not chaos. It was choreography. An army of riders moving as one. Neighbors poured from their homes, no longer hiding behind curtains. They lined the street, some in awe, some with hands held to their mouths in disbelief. Children clung to fences, their eyes wide as the sight unfolded. An endless procession of engines waiting, not to terrify, but to honor. The leader came to Martha one final time. He offered no speeches, no ceremony, only a nod. Deep, deliberate, carrying the weight of 1,000 voices unspoken. She returned it with a shaking smile, her tears glinting in the sun. Then, with a slow lift of his hand, the procession began. The first row of bikes crawled forward, their riders raising gloved hands in salute as they passed her porch. Behind them, another row followed, and then another. The sound grew. Not the furious roar of thunder, but a rolling tide, steady and unified, a living tribute carried on wheels. They rode past her home in perfect formation, each man giving her the same gesture of respect, some with a nod, others with 2 fingers lifted from their handlebars, a salute reserved for those who had earned more than words. Martha stood tall, her frailty forgotten, her figure framed against the newly painted walls of the house. She no longer her kindness. On the small wooden table beside her chair, lay a single leather glove. The leader had left it there without a word, resting it gently on her railing before he got on his bike. She didn't know his name, and he hadn't asked for hers. But that glove was more than a token. It was a promise. She closed her hand over it and whispered a prayer she hadn't dared to speak in years. Not for herself, but for the men who had reminded her that kindness, once given, always finds its way home. Outside, the wind stirred the snow. The street lay still, but in her heart Martha could still hear them. The low, steady hum of engines fading into forever, a song she would carry forever. Because sometimes the smallest act, a warm meal on a cold night, can ripple outward until it shakes the very ground beneath us. And perhaps that's the question we're left with. If kindness could summon 1,000 engines for Martha, what might it summon for you? Be kind. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that kindness is never wasted. And if you'd like to hear more untold stories of ordinary people sparking extraordinary moments, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.